It's the real news. I'm Aaron Mate. The White House says it believes Syrian President Bashar al-Assad is preparing a new chemical weapons attack and that he will pay a heavy price if it happens. The statement surprised many Pentagon officials who said they were kept in the dark. Speaking to Congress today, UN Ambassador Nikki Haley said the warning is also directed at Russia and Iran.
The goal is at this point not just to send Assad a message, but to send Russia and Iran a message that if this happens again, we are putting you on notice.
The warning comes at a time when the U.S. is increasingly taking aim at Iran in Syria and beyond. U.S. forces in Syria have targeted Iranian proxies on the ground. A series of news reports say White House officials want to target Iran in Syria and even oust its government in Tehran. And from President Trump on down, top administration members have made hostile comments and openly embraced Iran's rival, Saudi Arabia. Adam Weinstein is a policy associate at the National Iranian American Council. Adam, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us. So, each week seems to bring new developments in the Trump White House's confrontational posture towards Iran. Let's start with the latest. If you could respond to this statement that was put out by the White House yesterday, warning Syria and also Russia and Iran about a possible chemical weapons attack, and also talk about the context for what's happening right now with U.S. forces targeting Iranian proxies inside Syria.
It certainly seems like an unusual time for the Assad regime to conduct a chemical attack. We know that it likely has been a tactic of theirs in the past in which they sort of bombard a civilian population in order to send a message to other pockets of rebel resistance. But right now does not seem like a rational time for the Assad regime to be considering an attack. Furthermore, what casts doubt on the White House statement is the fact that the Pentagon had no idea about it. I think what we see is an escalation in Syria, followed by White House efforts to legitimize that escalation. So you look at targeting of Kataib, I believe it's Kataib Imam Ali, which is a militia that has some connections to Iran in the Al-Tanf area of Syria. The alleged reason for targeting that militia is that they were getting too close to U.S. special forces. But it's unusual because just a year ago, U.S. special forces were calling in close air support for that very same militia in operations in Iraq. So what we see is a sort of escalation that's happening in Syria, followed by White House efforts to legitimize that escalation and portray Iran or Iran-backed militias as the aggressor.
Yeah, Adam, there have been a series of reports in the media about this, as I mentioned, but on Friday there was a really important one in the Washington Post that did not get a lot of attention. But for the first time, it quoted a White House official, anonymously, but still had a quote, basically confirming that the goal now is to target and confront Iranian forces inside Syria. And that official was quoted as saying, if you're worried that any incident anywhere could cause Iran to take advantage of vulnerable U.S. forces, if you don't think America has real interests that are worth fighting for, then fine. The official also said that the expanded U.S. role would not require more troops, comparing it to the Rat Patrol, the 1960s television series about small Allied desert forces deployed against the Germans in northern Africa during World War II. The official in this piece basically confirming that also said that Iran is as much of a priority to the White House as is the Islamic State. Why is Iran and targeting Iranian forces such a priority for the U.S. inside Syria?
Well, I think it's a priority for the Trump administration and those around him. President Trump has surrounded himself by people who have long called for regime change in Iran. I also think it speaks to one of President Trump's campaign promises, where he said he was going to rip up the JCPOA and the nuclear deal, and he criticized the Obama administration very harshly for being supposedly soft on Iran. So I think there's a domestic element to it where the Trump administration is trying to appear as if it's sticking to its campaign promises, and the Trump administration is also has also surrounded itself by individuals who very much support, at a minimum, limited strikes on Iran and possibly even regime change. There's also neoconservative calls for regime change within some think tanks in Washington, D.C., that have a relationship with the Trump administration and may be influential to his thinking.
And we should say the calls for regime change are not even anonymous anymore. Speaking recently to Congress, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson said that the U.S. supports a transition of government inside Tehran. In fact, let's go to that clip.
Our policy towards Iran is to push back on this hegemony, contain their ability to develop, obviously, nuclear weapons, and to work towards support of those elements inside of Iran that would lead to a peaceful transition of that government.
Adam, when he talks there about a peaceful transition of government and supporting elements there that would further that goal, what and who is he talking about?
Well, I'm not sure who he is talking about, because there are no elements in Iran that are peaceful that would call for a full transition of government or a full regime change. Of course, there's the Mujahideen Khalq, who mostly exist in exile and were until 2012, I believe, listed as a foreign terrorist organization by the Department of State. But there are no elements within Iran calling for total regime change. Of course, there's a large segment of the Iranian population that is extremely critical of the Iranian government in Tehran, and they might even like to see a new government, but they've chosen to express themselves at the ballot box. And that's why we saw a 75% turnout at the recent presidential elections that re-elected Rouhani. That's why we saw in 2009 there were protests, but the protests were limited to electoral reforms, to the fact that the Iranian masses thought that their vote had been stolen. But the protests never rose to the level of calling for total regime change. So I'm not sure what Mr. Tillerson is talking about, what elements he's talking about.
Let's talk about some of the side effects of this hostility towards Iran. A lot of attention is on Syria, and rightly so, given the amount of foreign countries involved there, including the U.S. And Iran. But a place like Afghanistan does not get very much attention, even though the Iran role there, as you've written about, could be very critical. At the start of the U.S. invasion in 2001, Iran actually cooperated with the U.S. Against the Taliban. And you make the argument, which most people aren't familiar with, that the U.S. actually can't solve the Afghan war without Iran's help.
Well, that's true, and I'm not the only one who has made that argument. Scholars such as Ahmed Rashid, who's a famous journalist from Pakistan who wrote the book Taliban, among others. Barnett Rubin, who I believe is now at NYU, have also made those arguments that what you need is a regional solution for Afghanistan that includes Pakistan, that includes Iran. I think something that a lot of Americans don't realize is prior to 9/11, Iran had also been a victim of terrorism by the Taliban. Their diplomats in Mazar-e-Sharif were executed by the Taliban. At one point, it appeared that Iran might actually launch a ground invasion into Afghanistan, but they chose not to, mostly because they feared getting into a conflict with the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, and this is before 9/11. After 9/11, the Iranian government offered its condolences. The Iranian people especially offered their condolences, and Iran saw a mutual enemy in the Taliban and essentially shared intelligence with the U.S. And very much helped the U.S. early on in the war effort. In fact, a recent book about Iran and Pakistan written by Alex Vatanka, who's at the Middle East Institute, says that Taliban representatives went to Tehran and asked Iran essentially what would its position be if the U.S. were to invade Afghanistan, and Iran's answer was more or less, we don't support a Taliban government in Afghanistan. However, the Bush administration then labeled Iran as part of the axis of evil and and opened a new front in Iraq. And from Iran's perspective, it saw itself as surrounded by the U.S. military on both of its borders, and it did not view the war in Afghanistan as a conflict that was going to be quick, but one in which the U.S. would stay for possibly decades. And we now see that that's likely true. And so that's where you see Afghanistan. I mean, that's where you see Iran in some cases assisting elements of the Taliban, or at least keeping lines of communication open with the Taliban. And then you see a more contentious relationship. But the U.S. really squandered an opportunity to work with Iran, at least in the limited scope of stabilizing Afghanistan. And not only was this an opportunity to improve U.S.-Iran relations, but it is impossible for a landlocked country like Afghanistan to achieve some level of economic independence and some level of stability if it does not have a strong relationship with Iran and Pakistan.
Okay, and finally, another angle that I think is overlooked is the role of Democrats in all of this. Now, certainly it's true that the hostility from the Trump administration towards Iran is very different than what we saw under President Obama, who, of course, negotiated the nuclear deal. But I'm wondering to what extent Democratic policies in recent years and in recent decades have abetted this, have sort of laid the groundwork, perhaps, for what's happening today. We've had Democrats recently join with Republicans in voting for new sanctions on Iran, even after the recent attack inside Tehran. And there's a history of Democrats laying the groundwork for the more bellicose policies of their predecessors. I'm thinking about Iraq, where President George W. Bush invaded Iraq in 2003. But before that, you had years of U.S. sanctions that crippled Iraq, and also sporadic bombings by the U.S. under President Clinton. And I'm wondering if President Obama and his administration, notwithstanding the Iran nuclear deal, could have done more to avoid a situation like this today.
Well, I'm not sure that the Obama administration itself could have done more. You saw it received an immense amount of pushback for the JCPOA alone. I think the Obama administration hoped that a candidate would have been elected that would have continued its work. And I definitely think the Obama administration, at least as a long horizon goal, sought to normalize relations with Iran. But as you point out, when it comes to Iran, both Democrats and Republicans have been in agreement often about sanctions, about the label of Iran as the largest state sponsor of terrorism. And what we see in Washington, D.C., is that explicit state sponsors of terrorism, like Iran, which openly funds Hezbollah, for example, or has in the past funded Hamas, are treated much more harshly than what you might call implicit state sponsors of terrorism, like Saudi Arabia, which export extremism or clandestinely sponsor terrorist groups. And that double standard has produced very negative ramifications for U.S. foreign policy, in which we often ignore the bigger threat for a threat that just isn't that substantial to the U.S. It's not to say that Iran does not pose a threat to the U.S., but when Iran has just elected a moderate for a second...
Adam.
Yes.
How does Iran pose a threat to the U.S.?
Well, Iran does not, in my opinion, does not pose an existential threat, but Iran certainly has its own goals in the region that don't align with U.S. goals. Iran would like to have some influence in Iraq, and of course, it's only natural that it would have influence in Iraq the same way the U.S. has influence in Mexico. There's a shared culture there's a shared religion. They might not be Arab, but they share Shiism. Many of the clerical elite have intermarried with one another for generations. So there's a relationship there that's difficult to sever. But what I don't, so I understand the argument that Iran's support of groups like Hezbollah does pose a threat, but it doesn't pose an existential threat. And the way to approach that threat is not through military force or through an escalation of tensions or through a draconian sanctions regime.
Well, Adam, listen, I think this is tangential. I don't want to get into a big debate over it, but in terms of Iranian support for Hezbollah being a threat to the U.S., what that support means is that Hezbollah is able to fight Israel. And what is Hezbollah's goal? Why was it established? It was founded in response to Israel's invasion of Lebanon and has kept up the fight ever since as a way to deter Israeli aggression. But that is being sidetracked. Just one more thing. You said that Obama wanted to normalize relations with Iran, but why didn't he? He had the choice, but he didn't.
Well, I'm not sure he did have the choice. There was a lack of political will in the U.S. and there was a lack of political will in Iran. Once the JCPOA was achieved, you saw hardliners in Iran. There was an uptick in anti-U.S. rhetoric. There was an uptick in arrests. There was an uptick in censorship because I think hardliners were afraid of an opening. I think hardliners see an opening with the West as an existential threat to themselves. So I think Obama was in a difficult situation. Perhaps he could have pushed harder on trying to engage in talks with Iran on Syria. That might have been one way. Possibly Afghanistan. I think he tried to push. I think he could have provided more clarity to foreign businesses and to banks that they can now do business in Iran. I think there was a lack of clarity following the JCPOA, which led to a chilling effect in investment. And I think Iran very much resents that and feels that the U.S. has violated the spirit of the deal. So there are some things the Obama administration could have done, but Rome wasn't built in a day, and I think he needed more time.
And so lastly now, quickly, looking forward, what do you expect to see happening with the Trump administration and Iran? And what are possible areas of concern where the White House could ramp up confrontation even more?
Well, I think the biggest area of concern is that, frankly, I don't think the Trump administration even has an Iran policy. If they do have an Iran policy, the only one that's visible is one of confrontation. And I think we have no back channel diplomacy from what I know. You may remember that Secretary Kerry had Foreign Minister Zarif on speed dial if they needed to de-escalate something. And when the U.S. sailors ventured into Iranian territorial waters, they were released in less than 24 hours because of that relationship. Those relationships no longer exist. There is no diplomatic relationship, and there's a potential. There's so many potential sparks for an escalation in conflict that's either intentional or possibly a result of a misunderstanding. It could happen due to a naval incident in the Strait of Hormuz. It could happen in Syria. It could happen in Iraq. There's no telling. And I think that I don't know what the Trump administration itself envisions, and I don't think that obviously from what we've seen with the latest statement on the supposedly imminent chemical attack in Syria, the Trump administration doesn't seem to be in communication with many of its advisors. But certainly the inner circle around the Trump administration wants to see an escalation in tensions that eventually provoke Iran itself into leaving the JCPOA and a deterioration in relations. Whether the Trump administration wants a full-scale conflict with Iran is anybody's guess. I think that's still speculation at this point. But there are certainly elements within the Trump administration that have indicated that they would like to see a conflict with Iran, and certainly indicated they would like to see regime change. And I frankly don't see any path to regime change without a full-scale and disastrous conflict that would make Iraq look benign.
And just to clarify, for those who aren't familiar with the acronym, the JCPOA refers to the Iran nuclear deal. Adam Weinstein, Policy Associate at the National Iranian American Council. Adam, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News.